Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 8 The Illusion and the Arbiter. Hawk stared at the door to her father's suite. Her astral presence went unnoticed as people traveled the hallway around her. Though invisible to most, she worked as quickly as possible to avoid detection. Whispering a quiet incantation, her vision shifted, allowing her to see the magical energies protecting the portal. Hawk recognized the spellcraft as basic Terransay security protocol. Wards to defend against scrying and seals of secrecy to obstruct unwanted visitors, corporeal or astral in nature. With a flick of her wrist and another softly spoken word, the enchantment diminished. Hawk smiled to herself in satisfaction. She had been cracking the tower's security spells since childhood. With the enchantment now reduced, Hawk examined the remaining spell structure and began to meticulously deconstruct its remaining mechanics. As a child, Hawk's grasp of magical theory had initially confounded her tutors. She could readily perform the spells, but the questions she asked were so advanced in nature that they surpassed the skill sets of her teachers, leaving them confused and bewildered. Hawk soon realized that she simply understood magic differently than others. Her connection to magic ran deeper than thought alone. Hawk could see and feel the structure of spells as though it were a weave of fine cloth. She could see the systems and patterns used in its crafting, the matrix of threadwork that bound its structure and defined its purpose. Her birthright as heiress of Kalan had given her tremendous power, and with it, her ability to understand magic as no other. Hawk isolated and neutralized the remaining spells. She could now clandestinely enter her father's suite. Hawk willed herself to pass through the closed door. Ordwalk was nowhere to be found, but Warren was seated at his small desk near the door. The young man was occupied with the contents of a parchment on his desktop, and he took no notice of Hawk as she passed him by, intent on her own ends. After her argument with Ordwalk, Hawk had analyzed her memory of the altercation. When she'd mentioned a family library, Ordwalk had at first briefly panicked, his eyes darting toward an oil painting of his grandfather, Salat. He then immediately turned the conversation toward a subject sure to anger his daughter and deflect her questions. Hawk had surmised that Ordwalk, in his moment of panic, may have betrayed the location of his secret library, but she needed to take a closer look. Hawk regarded her great-grandfather's likeness with distaste. The resemblance to her father was uncanny. They both carried the same air of classic, narcissistic arrogance. Hawk examined the area around the painting. It occupied a narrow span of space nestled between stone columns. Nothing could be found to indicate a hidden entrance to a secret library. She whispered a quiet incantation, and once again her vision shifted, allowing her to see the magical energies that coursed throughout the tower. The stone columns set within the wall along either side of the painting ran from floor to ceiling. Hawk could see that the stonework was only a facade, hiding what she was certain to be copper conduits. Terran Say hosted a vast network of these conduits. Great machines of arcane nature relentlessly worked deep within the bowels of the tower, drawing magical energy from an intersection of key lines deep beneath the stone monolith. The energy flowed upwards through copper conduits, saturating the tower in the magical energies studied and manipulated by the residents living within. Two of these conduits, spaced closely and concealed, further led Hawk to believe that the wall before her was not as it seemed. She was unable to physically touch the surface in her astral form, but to all outward appearance it was solid stone. Hawk ran her fingers through her hair and sighed as she looked to her left. The stones in the wall sparkled with iridescence, an effect of the spell she was using to see magical energies. Though formed millions of years before, the stones still carried remnants of the planet's creation magic. She looked again at the section of wall before her. The stones were dull and lifeless. "It's an illusion," she whispered to herself in sudden understanding. Though she was unfamiliar with the spellcraft, she immediately understood the need for the conduits. An illusion with this level of complexity would require a steady stream of energy to properly function. Hawk returned her focus to the stone columns. She had scrutinized the adjacent wall near the painting, looking for any sign of magical energy, but the entire space was an abyss of nothingness, completely devoid of any traces of magical energy. Using this knowledge, she located the boundaries of the illusion and noticed an oddity along the right side of the magical dead zone, a small knot of magical energy. Hawk knelt and examined the knot. It was a nexus point of 3 distinct threads of magical energy. The threads coalesced into this nexus and flowed outward, disappearing at the illusion's boundary. She smiled to herself as the realization dawned upon her. The illusion was controlled by a magical lock, and she had just found the control mechanism hidden within the wall. Hawk recalled her astral form to her physical body. She had never studied illusion magic, but if she had any hope of uncovering her father's secrets, she knew she must learn. Hawk once again closed her eyes and entered the room within her mind. With a thought, she conjured her codex and searched the libraries for books on illusion magic. The top result immediately piqued her interest. It was a treatise on illusion spellcraft, flagged as restricted by the Conclave. The paper's restricted status wasn't noteworthy, as the Conclave flagged many such volumes as restricted or sensitive, but this paper had been written by Althenia, the librarian that Hawk had met earlier that morning. The codex that existed within Hawk's mind was unique. It was the original construct used to create the physical master copy presented to the Conclave. With the master copy, the Conclave could place restrictions on the flow of information to the lesser copies distributed throughout the tower. But Hawk's codex followed no such restrictions. She had modified it to display the Conclave's restricted titles as top results. Hawk read through the paper, but only gleaned a cursory understanding of the subject. The paper was instructional in nature, but also made numerous references and refutations to an established work on the subject that had been written by Hawk's great-grandfather Salat. Hawk's nose flared in disgust as she suddenly understood Althenia's presence in the lower vaults. It had nothing to do with her abilities, and everything to do with the subject of her paper. Her father jealously guarded what he saw as his family legacy. Hawk was certain she'd find a trail leading back to Ordwalk if she investigated Althenia's assignment to the lower vaults. Hawk turned the page of her codex and pulled up Salat's book on illusion spellcraft. She conjured a steaming cup of tea and settled back into her chair before beginning to read. The writing was less educational than self-aggrandizing in nature. Despite the book's shortcomings, after a few hours of study, Hawk was able to create simple illusions inside the room that existed within her mind. Hawk returned to her physical space. She fixed her gaze on the fireplace and spoke a series of incantations. A haze permeated the air before the hearth, obscuring the burning logs within. The air cleared, but the fireplace was now gone, a blank expanse of wall filling its place. Hawk examined the illusion she had cast and compared it against her memory of the illusion in Ordwalk's suite. The threadwork of her spell only matched a portion of the other. Something was missing. Did Salat intentionally withhold key elements to his spellcraft? She thought to herself. Hawke again read Althenia's treatise. With her burgeoning understanding of illusion spellcraft, she now realized what Althenia had done. She had not only refuted key principles of his work, Althenia had provided the missing pieces from Salat's book. Hawke applied Althenia's techniques to her illusion and then re-examined the spell's threadwork. It now matched that of the illusion in Ordwak's suite. Hawke shook her head in frustration. Althenia should have been praised for her work, but instead she had been punished for daring to improve upon the work of Salat, flawed as it clearly was. Hawke retrieved Cartha's record book from her desk and once again set off in the direction of the lower vaults. Ordwak may have seen fit to effectively banish the brilliant young woman, but Hawke vowed to right that wrong. A plan was formulating in her mind, but it would require assistance. Hawke smiled to herself as she picked up her pace. She had a new job in mind for the young librarian. Eric stared into the tunnel entrance. Its darkened doorway seemed to gaze back at the young chosen. The absolute darkness was a black mirror, its surface reflecting the mind's fears back upon itself, piercing the depths of the soul and promising doom to the unworthy who dared to pass beyond its ebon threshold. Two of the robed Ka descended the stone steps into the empty basin and took up positions on either side of the tunnel entrance. Daleth looked on with a smug expression. He said something to the man beside him, and the pair quietly chuckled. Galen raised his hands, and the gathering fell silent. "We come not lightly to this place," said Galen, "this place of judgment." Galen's voice echoed off the steep sandstone walls. He paused as though considering a solemn warning. Once silence had again settled over the hollow, he continued. "Who among you wishes for judgment?" Hoke stepped forward. "I, Hoke of the house of Kellan of Teransay, submit myself for judgment," he intoned as instructed. Galen swept his gaze over the assembled crowd. "Hoke of the house of Kellan of Teransay will be judged, as were we. For all Ka who carry the sword must face this trial, and only through the trial is your true warrior self revealed. The path that led Hoke to his place of judgment was unique. He has no arbiter, so it falls upon me to appoint one among us to observe." Eric watched as Galen's gaze again swept over the crowd. He noticed Kasich straighten his shoulders and adjust his stance as though he assumed that the task would fall to him. But Galen's eyes moved past the old Ka and settled upon Daleth. "Daleth Zika, I appoint you as arbiter," said Galen. Eric felt a palpable undercurrent of surprise and apprehension as hushed whispers gently rippled through the crowd. Daleth hesitated briefly, but quickly caught himself and mechanically stepped forward to join Hoke near the stone steps and the darkened tunnel beyond. His red mantis armor glinted and shined in the sunlight. Gone was his smug expression, replaced by a dead stare and a clenched jawline. "Follow me," said Galen as he descended the steps. Hoke and Daleth followed the Motavi into the empty basin. At a signal from Galen, one of the robed Ka produced a key from within the folds of his robe and unlocked the heavy iron gate. The other presented a worn leather bag to Daleth. The Ka warrior nodded solemnly and slung the bag over his armored shoulder. The two robed Ka took hold of the heavy gate and pushed it inward. The iron hinges groaned and squealed as the gate slowly opened. The walls within the tunnel began to glow with a soft light, gently illuminating the path ahead. "Proceed," said Galen as he motioned toward the tunnel entrance. "May your path lead you back. Through clarity of mind and strength of sword arm shall you return," intoned the robed Ka. Eric watched as Hoke and Daleth disappeared into the tunnel. The robed Ka quickly pulled the gate shut. Its hinges again squealed in protest until the heavy iron bars crashed back into place, once again sealing the entrance to the Valley of the Mantis. The crowd began to disperse as Galen bounded up the steps. He motioned to Kasich, and the old Ka made his way toward Eric. "Please join Galen and I above," said Kasich as he motioned to the cliff top looming ahead. Eric fell into step behind Kasich as the old Ka led them back into the rock house. They swept past the great wheel and entered an arched doorway along the far wall. Within, a spiral staircase had been carved from the sandstone. I'm afraid we have a bit of a climb before us, said Kasich as he mounted the first step. It seemed as though the stairs would never end. Each step only brought a view of further stairs beyond as they climbed the spiral higher and higher. The monotony of the climb was occasionally broken by a narrow window carved from the outer wall, giving a glimpse of the craggy hollow beyond. It was only through these windows that Eric could attempt to gauge how far they had climbed. Eric estimated that they were near the halfway point when a doorway to a landing appeared around the bend. The young chosen followed as Kasich exited the stairwell and continued down a narrow hallway. Eric gave the steps one final glance as they continued upward past the landing. "Do the stairs continue to the top of the cliff?" asked Eric as he quickened his pace to keep up with Kasich. The old Ka was surprisingly spry and energetic despite the long years etched into the lines of his face. "Yes, Unscarred," replied Kasich. "Thankfully we need not venture that far at this time." Eric continued to follow as Kasich led them through another arched doorway. The space opened upon a large terrace overlooking the valley of the Mantis below. Eric shielded his eyes from the brightness of the sky as he took in the view. Many miles in the distance, a cliff line could be seen running parallel to the wall of stone that Eric stood perched within. Nestled between the enclosing walls, dense stands of stonewood forest dominated the sloping valley floor, their leafy canopy a riot of colors. "The cliff walls keep the mantises contained?" asked Eric. Kasich approached the edge of the terrace and placed his hands upon the smooth stone railing. "It's more than just the heights that keep them contained. It was old Ka magic from the First Age that sealed this valley," replied Kasich. Eric willed a change to his vision and quickly identified a subtle matrix of energies rising from the valley walls like a great net, enclosing the terrace's opening and the sky above. The mantises that roamed this valley were the first protectors of the forest, keeping man at bay. They're apex predators, and like the stonewoods, they vary in color, perfectly adapted to hunting prey and Karas fawn, explained the old Ka. Eric nodded in understanding. Many of the warriors in Galen's retinue wore green armor, as well as the warmer tones of yellow, orange, and red, but Kasich and Galen alone sported the cooler tones of bluish purple and black. "The mantises colored in the cooler tones. Are they rarely encountered?" asked Eric. "Perhaps," replied Kasich. "Mantises molt as they age, and their color changes from green to yellow, to orange, to red, to purple, and to blue." "And what of the black mantis?" asked the young chosen. Kasich glanced at Eric and paused to consider his words. "There's an old poem among the Ka." He cleared his throat and began to recite. "The fearful pray for green, and the eager pray for red. The skillful pray for purple, where a novice would be dead. But of the mantis clad in black, I can rightly say, my only prayer is that our paths shall not cross this day." Kasich again fixed his gaze upon the young chosen. "There's something you must understand about mantises. As they age and molt, their temperament changes. They get more aggressive, but a change begins in them after they molt to purple. Their aggression wanes and their intelligence increases. You're in for an immediate fight with the warmer colors, as you called them. The aggressive mantises will attack on sight, but the cooler colors are devilishly smart and favor an ambush attack. They'll watch from the shadows and attack when their prey appears vulnerable. Mantises are also fiercely territorial. They hunt their younger rivals, so the older the mantis, the deadlier they become. And there are none more deadly than the black mantis. A mantis of that age has survived countless battles with rivals. They're physically imposing, and it's been observed that some are intelligent enough to conjure elemental magic. They are death incarnate," said Kasich. Eric nodded again. "If an encounter with a cooler color is rarely survived, then who's to say if they're rarely seen?" Kasich nodded in turn. "Usually, a failure is observed and reported by the Arbiter. You see, a warrior appointed as Arbiter is often one who wears purple or blue armor. All mantises are territorial, but they will rarely attack up their hierarchy, only down. So a warrior wearing blue need only fear attack from a blue or black mantis?" asked Eric. "That's right," confirmed Kasich. "Or in rare cases, even a purple. But a warrior wearing the blue should be able to handle a purple. In cases where both the Initiated and the Arbiter fail to return, it is assumed they ran afoul of a black mantis. Understanding suddenly dawned upon Eric. That's why you expected to be named as Arbiter. Kasich blinked in surprise at the statement. That's correct. Everybody expected it. Why wouldn't Galen appoint himself? Asked Eric. By your logic, a warrior in black armor would be the most likely to survive. Kasich nodded in agreement. Aye, those who wear the black need not fear the Valley of the Mantis. In fact, so long as they never removed their armor, they could settle down and live a quiet life. Fear of the black mantis runs deep within their own kind. If Galen entered the valley, he wouldn't even see a mantis. They would sense his armor's presence and keep well clear. Defeating the initiate's chance of completing the rite, said Eric. Exactly, replied Kasich. The pair spent a moment in quiet contemplation as they looked out over the vastness of the valley spread before them. Though narrow in width, the valley stretched beyond the horizon in length, giving the mantises living within thousands of square miles to roam. Does Galen's appointment of Daleth put Hoke in further danger? Asked Eric, breaking the silence. Kasich gave a short, barking laugh. No. It's Daleth that is in danger out there, and he knew it when he stepped forward. He may be hot-tempered and cocky, but he certainly isn't stupid. Do you think Hoke is skilled enough to take on a mantis? Asked Eric. Absolutely, replied Kasich without hesitation. I've seen Hoke swing a sword. I'd wager he could best a purple, maybe even a blue. Whoever trained him was as fine a swordmaster as any among the Ka. Eric chuckled. How would those Ka swordmasters feel about that statement? Kasich laughed in turn. You misunderstand me, Alik. Hoke may have been trained in Terransay, but he handles a sword in the way of a Ka warrior. Kasich remained thoughtful for a moment. Further proof that there are still those within the tower that keep the old ways alive, said the Ka quietly to himself. Further conversation on the subject was interrupted by the appearance of Galen. As though conjured into being, the Matavi materialized from the shadowy recesses of the terrace's threshold. So deftly did his black mantis armor conceal him within the darkened doorway. I apologize for the delay, said Galen without preamble. He glanced at Kasich. I've sent runners to the rest of our men, instructing them to make camp at the foot of the stairway to Karas Din and await our return. Kasich grimaced. That's an inauspicious place to pitch a tent. The men still have their blood up from the battle. A night near the Pillars of the Dead should bring some needed balance, replied Galen. The Pillars of the Dead, the epicenter of the battle between Chosen, where James had obliterated Alana the Fallen. The level of destruction was so complete that hundreds of years later still nothing grew, leaving only the dead remains of ancient stonewoods standing tall. Their branches long since fallen, they remained only as stone pillars, as worthy a monument to the dead as any grand memorial or silent tomb. Kasich pondered a moment and nodded in appreciation of his Motavi's reasoning. Have you told him yet what we're doing up here? Asked Galen as he fixed his pale blue eyes on the old Ka. Kasich snorted as he looked from Galen to Eric and shook his head. Well, I was just getting to it. Galen gave a wry smile and a short bow. My apologies, honored elder, but do make haste. We're waiting for a signal from the Arbiter, said Kasich flatly. Daleth's bag contains several smoke flares. We have watchers stationed along the wall in terraces like this one. If we see white smoke, then Hoke has succeeded, but black smoke means trouble. Eric nodded in understanding as he gazed out over the dense stonewood forest. He stood silently, fervently hoping that they wouldn't see black smoke. Hoke's eyes slowly adjusted to the brightness of the forest as he and Daleth emerged from the tunnel. Though they were in the afternoon shadow of the north-south running cliff line, the sun was still high enough in the sky to brightly illuminate the valley. Daleth sullenly trailed behind the Farron, quietly content with keeping his own counsel. Hoke scanned their surroundings. The eastern side of the cliff line had similar vegetation as the western side, but their similarities stopped there. Whereas the western side was riddled with waterways and deep hollows, the eastern side was barren and flat against the rocky precipice, only begrudgingly giving way to the towering stonewoods that dominated much of the valley floor. The Farron drew his sword and advanced upon the tree line, keeping a wary eye for movement among the colorful boughs. Daleth shouted in his native tongue, and Hoke stopped and sheathed his sword. He turned to face the Ka. Mate, I don't fucking speak Ka, shouted Hoke, interrupting the red-armored warrior. "I no like the Farron tongue," shouted Daleth in return. "Well, if you want me to understand what you're saying, then you'd better get over it," growled Hoke. Daleth muttered to himself in Ka before continuing in broken Farron. "The sooner Kata dies, the sooner I return to my people. Go and meet your death, Kata." Hoke gritted his teeth in anger. He knew from Kasek's words shared along the trail that Daleth as Arbiter was to shadow Hoke from a distance. He gave a thankful sigh of relief. At least he wouldn't have to share the trail with Daleth for long. "Just keep back like you're supposed to," said Hoke, "and keep that white smoke ready." Daleth chuckled as he motioned Hoke forward. "We will see, Kata. We will see." Hoke again drew his sword and resumed his march toward the tree line. He spotted a game trail and followed it into the underbrush, with Daleth distantly in tow. This wasn't the first time in Hoke's life that he had been thrust into a test of his skills with unreliable companions, but never had the stakes been higher. Before. Hoke eyed the stone before him. It was perfectly round, approximately 16 inches in diameter, and completely smooth except for a small space that was engraved with an identifying glyph and the number 100. The stone was his charge and his burden. To lose his stone was to lose his chance of success. Such a loss would ensure another 12 months of grueling training that Hoke had progressed beyond. This was his opportunity to prove himself and finally become a full-fledged ranger of Terransay. He need only gain the summit with his stone in tow before sundown. Hoke used his belt knife to strip a dozen tree limbs into narrow poles and to cut strips of leather from his belt. He then quickly set about lashing the poles around the stone and used the remains of his belt to fashion 2 thick straps. Hoke struggled for a moment with the awkward and heavy load as he worked his arms through the straps. Finally, he hefted the load high on his back near his shoulders. Hoke grunted with the effort as he began the long walk uphill. The stone weighed 100 pounds, and he could feel every ounce of it bearing down on his body as he forced one foot in front of the other. The physical challenge of carrying the heavy stone wasn't the only impediment to reaching the summit of the mountain. Hoke knew that within the surrounding forest lurked members of last year's graduating class. They were tasked with sabotaging the cadets and took wanton delight in their mission. Settling into a rhythm, Hoke lengthened his stride and began to travel in earnest. He kept a wary eye on his surroundings as he silently moved upward through the mountain forest. He kept his breathing controlled, in unison with his pace, letting his body function like a machine. As he walked, he focused his concentration on the forest sounds around him. The usual bouquet of bird songs had fallen silent, leaving only the fluttering of wind through the leaves. Hoke paused and surveyed the trail ahead. It narrowed as it passed a constriction between towering boulders, the only way through. A perfect place for an ambush, and the sudden quieting of the surrounding wildlife all but confirmed that danger lay ahead. Hoke twisted and shrugged his way free of the shoulder rig and carefully placed his stone within a small stand of juniper trees, concealing it among the foliage. The sweet smell of junipers permeated the air. Hoke breathed deeply of the scent and felt a momentary calm settle over his body. He slung his sword across his back and slowly crept toward the boulders, keeping well clear of the trail. Hoke pressed himself against the face of the boulder and reached upward with his hands, feeling for any purchase. His right hand settled into a deep pocket. He looked down, found a place for his left foot, and stepped up, allowing his left hand to find a ripple in the stone wide enough to pinch and grip. Moving slowly and quietly, Hoke ascended the granite boulder. Reaching the top, he peeked his head over the edge and looked around. A man waited in ambush along the trail, hidden within the boulder's shadow. Hoke was surprised to see that the man wore a similar shoulder rig bearing a stone. This was no first-year ranger. This was another cadet. Hoke decided on a brash approach. "Oi, mate," he shouted. "Are you having a shit down there or planning something nefarious? I can't tell from here, and I don't want to approach if it's the former." The surprised cadet attempted to quickly spin around, but the heavy load on his shoulders made the motion jerky and awkward. "You!" shouted the cadet, pointing at Hoke. "You're not going any further, pal." "Oh? Why's that?" asked Hoke. "We've heard about you, highborn. Your noble daddy pulled some strings, got you special training with Corso, If you're not good enough to train with us, then you're not good enough to graduate with us. So, you stop here," replied the cadet. Hoke laughed. "You're as dumb as you are ugly if you think my father approves of my choices, or weights any scales in my favor. Where's your stone, highborn? I bet your sister used her magic to shrink it to a mere pebble." "Pathetic!" shouted the cadet as he brandished his sword. Hoke gritted his teeth. Hawk had indeed offered her help, which came as no surprise, but he was left in shock when Corso had encouraged it. "Use every resource at your disposal," the swordmaster had told him. But Hoke stubbornly refused them both. He would complete this task on his own, like any other cadet. The cadet began to shout again, but Hoke neither listened nor allowed him to finish. He instead dashed toward the cadet, rushing down the sloping surface of the boulder. Hoke waited for the cadet to move to intercept him, and then suddenly dashed to his right. The cadet's heavy load in his shoulder rig slowed him enough to allow Hoke to slip past. He wrapped both hands around a slender tree growing alongside the boulder and swung his body against it. He extended his legs as he spun and caught the cadet in his chest with both of his feet, propelling the man onto his back. His shoulder rig broke apart with a loud cracking sound. The cadet's stone slipped free and began to roll down the trail, picking up speed as it went. "God damn you!" shouted the cadet. He leapt to his feet and began chasing the stone down the trail. He continued to shout curses at Hoke as he ran, his voice diminishing in volume as the distance between them grew. Hoke quickly gathered up his stone, shouldered his rig, and set off again toward the summit, avoiding the established trails and instead blazing his own path through the dense undergrowth. The others couldn't ambush him if he wasn't where they expected him to be. Now. Hoke pressed ahead. He had been tracking an elk for the past few hours. With no destination in mind and no goal beyond survival, he had decided to follow the elk's trail. From the size and depth of the tracks, Hoke judged it to be a large male, an old buck smart enough to have learned a trick or two about survival in the valley. The spacing of the tracks and presence of fresh spoor told Hoke that the elk was not only moving at a casual pace, but it was also close. If an old man of the forest such as this elk would walk this trail at ease, perhaps he could as well. Hoke rounded a bend in the game trail and was met with the sound of running water cascading through rocks. Another bend in the trail and the waterway came into sight. It was a wide and shallow stream running through a small clearing. The narrow pebbled banks were strewn with driftwood. Hoke glanced at the clear blue sky. This wasn't the place to be caught during a sudden downpour, but he judged he should be fine for the time being. Movement near the far bank made Hoke freeze, but he relaxed when he realized it was the elk he had been tracking. The old bull lifted his antlered head. Water ran and dripped from his thick brown mane as he regarded the lone human with an equal share of curiosity and indifference. Absent was any sense of fear. Danger in this valley had never come from man, only the mantis. Hoke nodded in greeting to the elk and slowly made his way along the bank, gathering up several armloads of driftwood. He arranged his camp in the manner of Kasich's instruction, a clearing free of cover and enough firewood to maintain a ring of fire that encircles your camp. Darkness fell quickly over the valley once the sun disappeared behind the western cliff line. He expected dawn would break just as quickly over the eastern ridge come the next morning, but that was hours away. He was trusting his life that Kasich's directions were sound. He had spent many nights in hostile territory, but never in a place with predators like the mantis. Hoke sighed and accepted his situation. Worrying over the hypotheticals was a waste of precious mental energy. He distributed more logs along the camp's blazing perimeter and then settled down against his pack. He rifled through his satchel and in short order pulled forth a small platter of steaming chicken and greens. He took a large bite and savored the juicy morsel's intricate blend of spices. He could find many faults in Terence, but the skill of her chefs was never in doubt. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.